Well, welcome everyone to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House program. My name is Christina Hartlieb. I'm the director here at the house, and this is our program, Merry Abolitionist Christmas, part of our Year of the Woman discussion series. We have some regulars here and some new faces, so we welcome you to listen, to talk, and to learn. Our hosts for this evening are Dr. John Getz and Dr. Christine Anderson, both of Xavier University, hence the Xavier reunion. But I will let them take it away in terms of what you want to start with to share.
Okay, I think the timeline is the first thing we'll do, as usual.
Okay, let's do timeline. Here we go. All right.
Great, thank you, Chris. And so, Merry Abolitionist Christmas to all of you. The abolitionists can't take credit for inventing the Christmas tree. That goes back to Germany, probably in the 16th century or thereabouts, but many of them were responsible for bringing it to the United States. Germans in the 1740s, as you see on the first entry there, started were doing Christmas trees in Pennsylvania, and that began to spread a little bit, but not too far because they were mostly in the rural areas. Christmas around the turn of the 19th century, around 1800, was kind of a rowdy event more than a sacred celebration. The custom of wassailing was very big at that time. People went around and begged for money and sang and drank a lot and were generally pretty obnoxious about it. So many people thought things needed to change. And part of what we see as Harriet, born in 1811, will kind of grow up with, and in the early decades of her life, we see this shift in Christmas to something more like what we know it to be today. So she's born in 1811. The concept of Santa Claus was introduced at least by Washington Irving. An American writer gets credit for some of that, at least, for talking about Sinterklaas in his 1809 Knickerbocker History of New York. Now, he was not an abolitionist, so he doesn't exactly fit in here. He was opposed to slavery, but typically for him, he didn't want to do anything about it or make too many waves. He was a pretty cautious guy. A visit from St. Nicholas in 1823 is also, though it's very important in our development of the figure of Santa Claus, unfortunately, Clement Moore, who's usually credited with writing the poem, though he was a Northerner, a New Yorker, he owned slaves, and he actually opposed abolition. So these first couple of people don't really fit the theme, but I put them in there for you to see how Christmas was developing in this first half of the 19th century into something like what we understand today. In the 1830s, Harriet moves to Walnut Hills, to what is today the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, with her father and family, and it's really his house during the years that the family is here. She's 21 at the time, so she's not a kid and didn't live in that house more than occasionally during the 18 years that she spent in Cincinnati. But also in the 1830s, we have the development of the Christmas fairs by the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. These disciples of William Lloyd Garrison wanted to use the fairs to raise money for the abolitionist cause and to publicize it. And one of their allies, one of their sponsors, was a guy named Charles Fallon, a German immigrant, who is given credit by a lot of sources for introducing the Christmas tree to New England, not to the whole United States, but to New England. Remember, we had in New England a strong Puritan heritage, partly kept alive by Lyman Beecher, Harriet's father, and that was against celebrating Christmas. It was seen as a sacred day, but not a time for festivity or or levity, but rather just respect. And you weren't supposed to make too much out of any single day within the calendar, or you started acting like Catholics or the Church of England. So, who were obviously not appreciated by the Presbyterians that Lyman Beecher reflected. But these fairs turned into bazaars after a while and became great fundraisers until 1858, when the people who ran them decided Christmas was becoming too commercialized, and they ceased them and turned them in and started running big dinners as fundraisers for abolition. Fallon, back to him for just a moment, Charles Fallon was a strong abolitionist. He had been a strong advocate for freedom back in Germany. And when he came over here, he got involved with abolition, and that got him fired from his teaching job at Harvard. So much for academic freedom in those times. Charles Dickens gets into the act a little bit here, not an American, not exactly an abolitionist, but a foe of slavery. He spoke out against it in his reflections on his tour doing readings in the United States. 1842, he publishes his notes about that and condemns American slavery. The next year, we got A Christmas Carol. So there's your Christmas connection with Charles Dickens. And he would continue to speak out against American slavery later on when he does a review of Uncle Tom's Cabin, praising the book and denouncing slavery again. Harriet, by 1850, is living in Brunswick, Maine, and by this time begins to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 1851 and 52, it becomes the blockbuster book that we know, and gets reviewed by Dickens, among many other people. A back note a little bit about the Christmas tree in the South. It was a little different story. There wasn't quite as much opposition to festivals of Christmas and to their possible connections, likely connections with earlier pre-Christian celebrations. But again, it was German immigrants who often played the role in the South in introducing the Christmas tree. And that would have been happening in the 1830s, about the time Fallon was introducing it in New England. Down to the bottom, we get two other notes about Christmas songs that we know about today that are connected to the abolitionist movement. 1855, abolitionist and Unitarian minister John Sullivan Dwight translates Cantique de Noël, which had been written in the 1840s by Placide Cappeau and Adolphe Adam, and Dwight translates it into the English version of the carol we know today, O Holy Night. And we'll talk a little bit about a change that he made in the translation later on. Adam, interestingly enough, was Jewish, the guy who wrote and Placide Cappeau, who wrote the words, was kind of nominally affiliated with the Catholic Church at that time, but wound up leaving it later on. So, O Holy Night turns out to have been written by, composed by an eventual non-believer and a Jewish composer. 1863, the second to last entry there, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, familiar to students of American literature, writes the poem Christmas Bells and publishes it 2 years later. This was a terrible time in Longfellow's life. 2 years before that, in 1861, his wife, who was his second wife, he had lost his first wife, and she died in a miscarriage. His second wife died in a house fire. She was sealing envelopes or sealing wax to preserve locks of her daughter's hair, and her dress caught fire, which was a very common occurrence in the 18th and 19th century for women wearing those big skirts. So her dress catches fire. Longfellow desperately tries to save her. He suffers severe burns, and she dies the next day. So he had that on his mind in 1863, plus he had his son on his mind, who had, against Longfellow's wishes, gone off to fight in the Civil War for the Union. And in November, Longfellow heard that his son had been seriously wounded. And he didn't know whether he was going to make it or what was going to happen by Christmas Day. So you can see that this poem had a lot of meaning for him. And the music it was set to in 1872 is not the music that we know I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day by today. That music doesn't come until the 1950s and gave Bing Crosby a big hit song at Christmas time that year. Also, one note that I discovered afterwards, after making this timeline, O Little Town of Bethlehem also owes something to the abolitionist movement. It was composed by an abolitionist Episcopal preacher, Philip Brooks. He was such an ardent abolitionist, he was asked to give the eulogy at Lincoln's funeral in 1865. And he was so exhausted by that experience and by nursing his flock through the Civil War that he took a tour of the Holy Land, and upon visiting Bethlehem, he had a memory that he later turned into O Little Town of Bethlehem in 1868. So that too has a connection with abolition. And maybe to wrap this one up, President Grant made Christmas a federal holiday by 1870 in a desperate effort to unite the North and the South 5 years after the end of the Civil War. Well, obviously that didn't work very well. It took more than a holiday to, or would have taken more than a holiday to do that. So that kind of gives you an overview of some of the things we'll talk about tonight. And I want to kick it back to Christina right now, who's going to show a video that some of you may have seen already getting ready for tonight. But I want to get this out for everybody. It's about a 3-minute video how women used Christmas to fight slavery. Are you getting sound?
No.
No, no sound.
No. All right, well, let me fix the sound. Sorry.
Okay, you can start it over again.
I will start it over. What do I do?
Where's your share screen?
Right here.
Stop sharing for a second. Okay, now go to share screen. Yeah. And make sure you select down here, share computer set. There you go. Other duties as assigned.
What do abolitionists have to do with how we celebrate Christmas? Only the amazing women who decided to fight slavery by spreading holiday cheer. In the 1830s, the United States was already extremely divided over the issue of slavery. Northerners had begun formally organizing against the practice, including Bostonians, specifically Boston's women. Inspired by the recent efforts of William Lloyd Garrison, female abolitionists formed the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. While many New Englanders didn't support slavery, many were also indifferent toward the issue. The Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society wanted to bring awareness to their cause, but needed the funds to do so. So, in 1834, these women, namely Maria Weston Chapman, Lydia Maria Child, and Louisa Loring, decided to host a small Christmas time fair where people could buy homemade Christmas gifts and meet fellow abolitionists. Held in one of the members' homes, the first event raised over $300 for the cause. The next year, again held in a member's house, a pro-slavery mob attacked the fair. So, Maria Chapman held it in her own home. When that was attacked, her parents hosted the event. Maria refused to be intimidated and defiantly proclaimed that the Christmas fair would be an annual event. Over the next 20-plus years, the fair became a Boston tradition, growing into, according to Uncle Tom's Cabin author Harriet Beecher Stowe, the most fashionable shopping resort of the holidays. In the months leading up to the fair, abolitionist women across New England formed sewing circles in their respective towns to create goods to sell at the fair in Boston. These sewing circles also provided a safe space to discuss abolition in rural areas, where their views might not be as supported. Chapman spread the word in William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, the preeminent abolitionist newsletter of the era. The fair itself also became more openly activist in 1840 after introducing nighttime soirees and abolitionist lecturers featuring both men and women. The goods for sale themselves reflected the cause. Quills were labeled "Weapons for Abolitionists." Watch cases read, "The political economist counts time by years. The suffering slave reckons it by minutes." And by the early 1840s, Chapman added a new feature to the fair, a Christmas tree, one of New England's first. The tradition of the Christmas tree had been brought to America by German immigrants, and the fair organizers adorned it with children's gifts for sale, making it a prime attraction for New England families. The bazaar, as the fair became known after 1845, was taking off in popularity, occupying Boston's Faneuil Hall for over a week by the 1850s. But Chapman and the other organizers worried their abolitionist message was getting lost in consumerism. So Chapman officially abolished the fair in 1858, replacing it with annual gala dinners attended by the Anti-Slavery Society's most generous donors. But the Christmas Bazaar was successful in more ways than one. Not only did it raise money for the abolitionist cause, it demonstrated the growing political power of women.
That's great, John. How did you find that?
Sort of by accident a while back, about 6 months ago or so.
It's great. Why do you think these women were so successful in the Boston Anti-Slavery Society? What can we, to what can we credit that, do you think?
That's a question for everybody.
Yeah.
Would you like me to put up the questions?
Good idea.
Okay, I can do that. Okay, there you go. So this really focuses on the first question, what Dr. Anderson mentioned. Why do you think the bazaars were so successful?
Well, I have one idea that I'll throw out there. You know, abolition was not a popular movement. And you could tell that by the fact that there were riots outside of these first Christmas fairs. And one of the problems for the movement was to attract people, right? And slavery was such an uncomfortable thing to talk about and such an unpleasant thing to talk about, especially at the holidays. But instead, you could draw people who might not otherwise become involved in abolition to these fairs that blended abolition with consumerism, right? So they could buy things that had been made by women. Sometimes they would import things from France or England, right? And I love all those little things all those little mottos. My favorite is that children could buy candy at the Boston Fair. And then when they unwrapped the paper, it said, "Come, little ones, for the sweets ye see were made by the labor of the free, and freely today you may partake, even for the toil-worn bondsman's sake." Right? So you could eat candy and do good at the same time, which made abolition and the fairs really, I think, more popular, don't you?
Any other ideas from people?
Someone in the chat said organization and determination.
That's what Frederick Douglass said.
Mm-hmm.
He said they were inventive.
If I can add, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I would go more with the consumerism. In the Midwest, there was a lot of Germans who were settled, and they had their Weihnachtsfest and their Christkindlesmarkt marks. They were celebrating with consumerism as we see now. And I think it would be something that the East would say, well, look, they're having fun with their markets at that time. Why can't we do much the same thing, although we don't have a large German population? So that could be one of the reasons it was successful, is because it was already successful for non-abolitionist reasons in the Midwest.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if it also might not have been attractive because it gave people a reason to rally around doing good, you know, a sort of a philanthropic activity that was blended with a social event as well. It sounds like Christmas was just sort of getting started, and I've been wondering and wanting to look into what were the normal Christmas customs of the time, and all I read was brawling and fighting and drinking. So maybe you could give us a little bit more background about that. But I mean, it sounds like a lot of fun. You can go to a bazaar, you can buy some stuff, you can spend your money and do good at the same time. And probably a lot of people were learning about something they didn't really know much about, which was this thing called slavery and the abolitionist movement. So maybe a bit of a giving back kind of feeling that way.
Yeah. And
I think it was probably very non-threatening, and even people who didn't necessarily know anything about the abolitionist movement or really care could get some education sort of on the side while they were enjoying themselves and picking up some nice craftsmanship.
Mm-hmm. And you know, when you go back to the old rowdy Christmases, there was a real class element there. The rowdy crowds, you know, that came wassailing and not asked but demanded piggy pudding. Those were working class people pounding on the doors of the wealthy. But these fairs were middle class, respectable, you know, this emerging 1830s and 40s middle class. And these women are respectable women, and they're doing this in their own homes. They're planning this, they're making things. So that I think it changes the respectability of Christmas and the domesticity. I mean, after all, even old St. Nick, you know, it's a very domestic scene. He comes down the chimney, right? He comes into your home and doesn't disrupt it, but leaves things for you.
It must have also been very empowering for these women to have, I mean, they're described as really leading the charge here. And I got a sense that it was very rewarding for them to have a cause. And some of what I read, it indicated that it led into the suffrage movement as well. So.
We also have a comment in the chat that talks about what kind of from the timeline, Irving was referenced, and then it was Clement Moore who promoted Santa in the first quarter of the 19th century to make Christmas a more family-centered event. And I have to admit, when I was reading the stuff for tonight and I went back and I was like, this was before I read the timeline. I was like, okay, so Visit from St. Nick, when was that? Because that's kind of what we perceive as Santa. And then I Googled it, whatever, 1823. And I'm like, but that's before the bazaar. So where was, how about the Christmas tree in Visit from St. Nick? And I'm like, so then I went back and read the Visit from St. Nicholas. There is no Christmas tree. Santa comes down the chimney, the stockings are hung with care, and there's no Christmas tree. So.
Right. So I happen to be involved with a lot of very elderly German ladies, and they tell me that, of course, it's St. Nicholas in Germany. It's not Santa Claus, and that occurs on December 6th. It doesn't involve a Christmas tree then. It involves putting treats and toys and candies in your shoes that are left out over the night. So Santa Claus came a little later than that, and Santa Claus doesn't come down the chimney in most of Germany. He comes to the front door. He comes with another person with him who is named Krampus, who is sort of like the devil. So you're a good bad here. He doesn't come with elves. He comes with a nasty guy. And they talk to the children. And if the children are good, Santa Claus will give them a gift. But if they're bad, supposedly Krampus will pick them up and throw them in the bag and take them away. And Krampus isn't evil. He travels with Santa Claus. He comes to the front door with them, is what they tell me. And so it's a different tradition of Santa Claus in Germany, even now, than it is here in the United States.
I will second the shoe thing, because I used to do that as a child. I would set my shoes outside my bedroom door on December 5th, because they were supposed to be filled with goodies and treats. And it was just like a little preview for Christmas for us. And I think my parents picked up that tradition because when I was a toddler, my dad was stationed at a army base in West Germany. And so we lived in Germany for a year, and I don't remember a thing about it, but that was a tradition that my parents picked up there and brought back to our family. So we also have a couple other things in the chat talking about, Kenneth says the historian Stephen Nissenbaum says it's not religion, but domesticity that changed Christmas from a rowdy celebration to a family-centered event. And then Amy notes that on the PBS show Victoria, they show Prince Albert bringing the idea of a Christmas tree to England. And I've watched Victoria, and I don't remember that part, but that makes total sense. And then Kenneth also says our Christmas traditions are an amalgam of many traditions. I'm probably not saying that right, but
Amalgam.
Yeah, it's a conglomeration of many different traditions. Okay, so
let me speak to the reference to Victoria and Albert. That was in the late 1840s, 1848 or 49. There was a sketch published in a British paper or magazine of Victoria and Albert hanging out around their Christmas tree. You know, Albert had a German background, and there they were, and that gave a big impetus to the prominence of the Christmas tree in both Britain and in the U.S. So they were trendsetters. The royal family was a trendsetter then, as they sometimes are these days.
So Albert did make it popular, but Queen Charlotte had one earlier as well, according to the London Evening News that Kenneth is talking about here. So, and then also Carlos mentions, don't forget Sinterklaas of the Dutch settlers in New York State.
That's
so
what
all of these are different ideas of a German or of a European vision of Santa Claus that gets, you know, kind of morphed here in the United States.
Alison.
Yeah, Alison says when she was a child visiting England, they put pillowcases at the foot of the bed on Christmas Eve, and Father Christmas would put goodies in those.
Ooh.
As opposed to your stockings, I guess.
Big gifts. You should also know that the song Tannenbaum was not originally made as a Christmas song. It's Tannenbaum is a generic word for fir tree. In Germany, a Christmas tree is a Weihnachtsbaum or a Christkindlbaum. Tannenbaum is just a generic fir tree. And so the song Tannenbaum actually is a lament of a man who had an unfaithful lover. So the word translations would be fir tree, how true you are with your green leaves. You're true even in the summer and the winter, and how true you are as opposed to his lover who is not true, and how the tree makes him happy because it is true year round.
Interesting.
There's also a Cincinnati connection with the sewing garments, or sewing, not gifts exactly, but on the Harriet Beecher Stowe House website, there's an article about the Cincinnati anti-slavery sewing circle that from 1846 to 61 sewed clothes for people who were trying to escape slavery. So they could have decent clothes and blend in a little better on their way to Canada or wherever they were trying to go. And one of the figures who may or may not have been associated with them her name was Kitty Doram. She was somebody who fled slavery in Kentucky and used her sewing skills to get wealthy in Cincinnati, and worked on the Underground Railroad and sewed clothes for freedom seekers, and may or may not have been involved with this Cincinnati anti-slavery sewing circle. But there's a local side to this too, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So I took the questions off so we could see people as they were talking, but I can put them back up at any time.
You know, I think this theme of domesticity is important too, that women could prepare for these fairs domestically. It was a way for them to raise money. Remember, women did not have independent legal rights, especially if they were married. So some charities had a very hard time with this, because if they were women's charities, they had to find someone unmarried who could be in control of the funds, because none of the married women could do it. But this way, because these events are, you know, the Anti-Slavery Society is both men and women. And of course, there's no better way to make fun of a man than to say that he is effeminate. And so there were people who didn't like abolitionists who, because of these fairs, because they were so associated with women, would tease the men and call them Aunt Nancy men for having these promiscuous gatherings, meaning that there were both men and women speaking at them. And sometimes the women would have to form a circle around them to protect the men. So, you know, this gave women a way to be domestic, not break the rules, but still be very empowering for them, I think.
Nancy is still used as a term for effeminate men.
Mm-hmm.
It's still.
And I think in some circles, it's still an insult.
One of the things that I found interesting in the articles was the question of the discipline of children, and how, and I guess this was reminded of this, Dan, when you were talking about the bad guy that came along with Santa in Germany, because it appears that the abolitionists use this as a way of eliminating or reducing the violence against children, and they could sell that socially because there was a lot of violence, and kids were beaten for minor infractions in their own family. At least I know from my own grandfather and great grandfather's experiences, which were horrid, to the way they would be treated on the street. But the carryover then, that the abolitionists and, you know, the women that were promoting this nonviolence then carried over to the slaves, and the idea that slaves were people too, and they deserved to not be beaten, and they also were in a position to enjoy a lack of violence. And so there was a certain promotion of that. So, you know, there were these two layers, you know, let's deliver the child message. And then underneath that, if you accept the child message, then you must also start to become amenable to the anti-violence against slaves. And I thought that was very astute. And of course, as women, as feminists and suffragists have been over time, they often did those kinds of hidden messages. You know, they couldn't be as blatant. They couldn't stand up like a man on a soapbox and scream, you know, the truth. So they delivered it in palatable pieces like that.
That's an observation of intersectionality again, I think, between the plight of kids not being beaten and the women's movement, which is growing up right alongside of abolition at this time, and to see those connections, I think, is really important. Looks like we have another comment from somebody coming in here.
I think that's a good point. We should probably use the term enslaved people.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. Whoop. Oh, wait a minute.
We, at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, and our docents do try to use the term enslaved people as the way of referring to. However, sometimes it gets...
It's hard. It's retraining
yes,
ourselves.
it's a retraining issue. Yes, I would agree. So we will endeavor to use the term.
Also, it's always confusing for me as a historian when I'm teaching to remember that people in the past used words that we don't use anymore. And so I keep having to remind students that some of those words you might use when you quote somebody, but you wouldn't say them today.
I had that conversation with my 10th graders at the beginning of every year, and we talked about different variations of a word that starts with "in" and what was used in some circles and sometimes, yes.
Or the word colored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, all right, so we have another comment that talks about Southerners, including historians, perpetuated the myth that enslaved people were treated well at Christmas. Diaries show that some were given time off, but it was not universal.
They were also given liquor.
And Frederick Douglass really spoke out against that, arguing any small favors that might have been allowed to at Christmas time were really given with the motive of placating them for a moment and sending them back out into the fields or doing whatever they were supposed to be doing. He really saw that as an underhanded way to continue to manipulate the people who were enslaved. And the alcohol that they were sometimes given at that time too, he saw as part of that package too. Well, maybe we should ask the question, why was there this intersectionality? Why did these Christmas customs, abolition, the first wave of feminism, why were all the, and a desire to protect children's rights, why did they all come together at this time? Any ideas about that?
Well, there are some historical themes. Two important things were happening at this time. One is the economy was changing. It was becoming much more market-oriented and industrial. So people were buying things, right? And so buying things, and you know, some contemporary today economists point out that we get a shot of adrenaline when we buy something. So that's one thing that's going on. There are also a slew of reform movements that Americans, and this is very hopeful, it's in some ways tied to the Second Great Awakening, this idea that we can become better, right? So that the Graham diet was actually a way to avoid alcohol. Children's rights, the care of mentally ill people, all as well as abolition. So all of those are going on. The historian Nancy Welter says that the cult of domesticity had its own seeds of destruction within it. And I think she's talking about the ways that if women were domestic and they were purer and better than men, and that's part of what was going on here, that's why they were domestic, had to be sheltered. But if they were so good, shouldn't they be doing something to help reform the world? And so in some ways, these fairs illustrate that, I think.
Much as Harriet Beecher Stowe did when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. There's certainly lots of domesticity in that book. All the emphasis on mothers and children, the Rachel Halliday household and on the Underground Railroad in Indiana, clearly a matriarchal household. But it's a way of trying to change the world, starting with the house, with the home and radiating out from there. So, yeah, and Harriet, I think, knew in writing Uncle Tom's Cabin that she needed to kind of cloak it. Well, I think she believed this too, in the value of women and their moral superiority to men, and that they could have an impact on men to change them, to improve them.
You know, John, I read your timeline, and so today I Googled the Harriet Beecher Stowe story in 1850.
Oh, The Good Fairy.
About the Good Fairy. What a lovely little Christmas story about exactly that, about a young woman who is taught by her aunt to be charitable at Christmas, to give presents to the deserving poor, the unfortunate.
Yeah, it was an active kind of domesticity. These women were clamoring to have an impact, to do something, but they knew if they came on too strong, they would be rejected and viewed as unfeminine. So working within those constraints, they tried to have an impact.
Mm-hmm. But you have to wonder, and some historians have, there's a little bit of a disconnect between this idea of giving, of compassion, and the consumerism. So it's about the same time that she writes that story that Harriet Beecher Stowe is saying, what she's quoted in that film, is saying that the Boston Bazaar was decidedly the most fashionable shopping resort of the holidays. Well, being fashionable is not always entirely compatible with charity.
Well, I think Harriet found out the limits of consumerism when she built that first very expensive house in Connecticut, and then in Hartford, and then had to leave to downsize because she couldn't support it. She was a bit of a spendthrift herself, I think, and was always having to write more, crank out more books, more work in order to pay for the servants and for the house and, you know, the lifestyle that she wanted too. So there is a contradiction there.
John, wasn't Harriet raised in a tradition of there being no Christmas and no celebration, and then made a decision as an adult to switch over to the Episcopal Church, which did celebrate the Christmas holiday. So as a Presbyterian, she didn't have those kinds of celebrations. Is that right?
Well, that's half the story on her, because that's her father's lineage is strongly Presbyterian, but on her mother's side, her mother came from an Episcopal family. And there are some stories about Harriet kind of bringing the idea of gift giving into her for her nieces and nephews, even when she was a fairly young woman. So because Christmas was celebrated on her mother's side. Now, her mother died when Harriet was 5 years old, but she maintained contact with aunts and uncles on that side of the foot side of the family.
I have another question about the Christmas bazaar and that whole celebration. One of the ads in the materials that I read that you had recommended talks about the fact that the bazaar is open, and it says, among them are the elegant donations of friends in France, Switzerland, and Germany, and Great Britain. And I'm wondering, is it reading too much into this to think that there's a reach? You know, we know that Britain at that point is, there's no more slavery supposedly in the British Empire, correct? At that time. And is there any connection here with trying to pull some of that influence into the bazaar and then filter it out into the United States?
Well, Chris could talk about this probably more than I can, but I think it was an international movement to try to get rid of slavery.
And so that's one of the reasons they would have pulled the European countries in as well?
Right.
The bazaar?
Some of the anti-slavery women were very wealthy, and they would purchase things in France and England and send them back, sometimes with instructions for how much to mark them up to make more money. So there was an international movement, but there was also, again, this element of fashion that Harriet noticed. So I think both things were happening. And sadly, I don't know if they had these kinds of fairs and bazaars in Europe.
Well, Britain had gotten rid of slavery even in the colonies in the 1830s, right? Between 33 and 38, they got rid of that. But we watched a documentary on PBS just recently about how many British citizens owned slaves and sought compensation for their slaves, the enslaved people, as they were being emancipated in the 1830s. So there were people who were still trying to make a buck at the expense of people being turned into property, even as they were being liberated from that. And of course, no reparations were ever paid to the slaves who had been enslaved, who had claimed to own them, who were compensated for their supposed losses. Well, let's look at some other, we don't have too much time left, so let's look at some other connections between abolition and Christmas. And Chris, if you could put up the screenshot of the songs. We talked about, yeah, this is good. We talked about "O Holy Night," and the difference in Dwight's translation of that. It's pretty much literal, except for this one stanza that I want us to look at. The literal translation says, the Redeemer, in French, of course, originally, the Redeemer has broken every bond, the earth is free and heaven is open. He sees a brother where there was only a slave. Love unites those whom iron had chained. Who will tell him of our gratitude? For all of us he is born, he suffers and dies. Translated, that's pretty literal. However, Dwight put it this way, and remember, Dwight is doing this in 1855. Truly, he taught us to love one another. His law is love and his gospel is peace. Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother. And in his name all oppression shall cease. Sweet hymns of joy and grateful chorus raise we, let all within us praise his holy name. What's the difference? How does he depart from the literal in his translation? Anybody see any differences there?
I see nothing but differences.
Well, what are they?
I mean, just take it from the first line. He taught us to love one another. I mean, that's different than he's broken every bond. I mean,
Okay.
am I missing something here?
No,
It doesn't
no,
seem like a very accurate translation to me.
So we get love instead of maybe brotherhood in the literal, but it turns into love.
Mhm.
Although love shows up in the third from last line in the original. Any other differences anybody sees?
Well, the one thing that's not different is in both of them, they say the slave is our brother.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the differences you can attribute to the fact that he's translating it in order to put it to music. And so it had to have a certain meter and rhythm. So you can, if you try to sing that literal translation to the tune of O Holy Night, it's terrible.
Yes, good point.
And the second one is much smoother. It seems more universal, that whole idea of the love and peace idea. And then of course the sweet hymns of joy, that's the part of the Christmas cliche, the sweet hymns of joy, which of course we'll be singing again this year, despite the fact there aren't a whole lot of reasons to have sweet hymns of joy at Christmas. But I see it as a lot of it being just the reality of the lyricist needing to make it work.
And he was a music critic and music teacher, Dwight was, so he would certainly have an ear for that. What only strikes me is the verb tenses in the two. In the literal translation, he sees a brother where there was only a slave. It's in the past. The Redeemer has broken every bond. Slavery's over. And in France and in French possessions, it almost was by that time. By 1848, just a few years later, the last of the French, even islands in the Caribbean, where slavery was abolished there. The biggest French possession that thrived on slavery was Haiti, and that had been independent for a few decades by this time, by the 1840s. So slavery may have seemed, and neither Adam nor Capot was a particular political activist at this point. So it may have seemed to them that slavery was a thing of the past in regard to France. But it certainly didn't seem like that to Dwight in the US, who was saying, chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother. Almost looking ahead to the Battle Hymn of the Republic and the avenging God who is going to come in and break the slaves. And in his name, all oppression shall cease. That's pretty strong wording, I think, and reflects Dwight's deep abolitionist sentiments in the 1850s. Now, the Longfellow set to verses, as I heard the bells on Christmas Day, is also interesting because it becomes a different sort of, a different kind of hymn. because of the sad part. These are the stanzas that are usually left out in versions today. Sometimes singers don't even get past the first couple of stanzas when they're recording this. But when you look at these stanzas that are usually not sung today, and were not part of the Bing Crosby version or most of the popular versions, look, the first stanza is not that memorable. But if you look at the next two, you really see the Civil War context coming through. Then from each black accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of the continent, and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men. I guess those lines seemed a little too bleak and maybe too topical for people who wanted to turn it into a more joyous Christmas carol, but you're still kind of stuck with the one verse toward the end of the song that we have today about somehow the person reaches a kind of despair. And in despair, I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. So that kind of remains in many versions today, but it doesn't have that context. And I was looking at different versions of this on YouTube and various places. And strangely enough, the Carpenters have a version of this song. Everybody remembers the Carpenters, or am I the only one old enough to remember them? Done apparently in maybe the late 1970s. They were doing a lot of Christmas music then and Christmas specials, in which they do not include these verses, but there's a visual. They're singing for a while at the beginning, and then it cuts to all these war scenes. Not just Civil War, there's some old looking cannons, but then there are, looks like scenes from World War I, World War II, and maybe later, that flash on screen, almost like a YouTube or like an MTV video. This is before MTV, I think. But they sort of must have been attuned to this earlier root of the song. So what do you think about the changes that are made in these songs, and to talk about them the way we're doing it tonight? Does that change your view of any of these Christmas songs, or enhance your understanding, your appreciation for them, or what do you think?
It makes me want to go back and read the lyrics to all the different Christmas songs so I can see if I can see any other connections, or what are they really talking about in there?
And we did some of that last Christmas when we looked at some of the spirituals that came out of African American culture at this time, antebellum songs, and yeah, a lot of times you could see some of the typology in there that shows up in a lot of the writing of African Americans too. You know, rise up, follow that star. Well, there were reasons to follow a star. If you were trying to escape slavery, you would follow the North Star. So I think, well, there's a lot of, there are those double meanings that come from the context, I think. I don't want to ruin Christmas carols for people. I hope that it enhances them.
You know, I think it does, John. This is going to be a difficult Christmas, as Joanne said, for all of us. We're living through extraordinary times as well. And so to link up to a past that wasn't always Mary, Mary, but that has more depth, I think that's wonderful. I appreciate your doing it.
Anybody else? I think that, to know about the context and to connect it as you just did with the context today, with our context, I think is very important. And when I was working up material for tonight, I kept thinking of Hamilton and of what Lin-Manuel Miranda did with that. And he said, this is, I've got to read the exact quote. He said, this is a story about America then, told by America now, and we want to eliminate any distance between a contemporary audience and this story. So to me, that, it does connect us with the past, but it also maybe gives us some resilience to deal with what we have to deal with.
I think it's invaluable in giving us some context for what we're going through. And, the story of America is far from the Trump-Biden situation. And we're all part of many years, centuries of America, and this helps, I think, to tie us all into all of that, and we've got, Black Lives Matter, we've got, the racial protests. It's here, it's still with us, it's still painful, it's still disturbing. And that's part of our Christmas this year, and it's part of our Christmas every year. And here we are. I consider most of the people on this call, at least, are the privileged, mm-hmm. And it's painful for us. What must it be for the Black community? What must it be? We, thank God, have not had COVID touch us directly yet. We right now have people being in quarantine, but we don't know. Or we haven't lost anyone, but it still tears my heart out just to think of what people are going through, let alone those people and what they really are going through, and what must they be feeling. And all of what we're talking about tonight, everything from the suffragists to the abolitionists, to the whole idea of Christmas and what does it mean, to Christmas in the context of wars, to the left and the right, the abolitionists versus the people who had no stomach for abolition. Here we are, right here and right now.
Can I say something? Those last two lines of Longfellow's poem, I think it's surprising, the condemnation in there, the condemnation of slavery and the behavior in what was going on at the time in the South. That was also really, to me, it's really reassuring that people could speak out in whatever way it was. And for Wadsworth, for him, it was through this poem. And it's just a reminder that we keep speaking out in whatever ways work for us at the time. So.
We need all the witness we can find.
Kind of summarizes or talks about our kind of overall interpretive theme, the power of voice, and how the power of voice can change lots of different things. But all right.
As well as writing the next chapter together.
Yes, exactly.
Very much so. Very much so.
And you're setting up a great segue for me to do a quick commercial.
Okay, so you want to do the commercial, or I've got a whole commercial written out, but go ahead.
Go ahead. You do it. And then I'll come on at the end, maybe.
Okay, so Thank you all for attending this. This is our last public program for the year. We do have our annual member meeting tomorrow night and our volunteer Zoom party on Sunday. This is the last public-facing program. We do have a full lineup of programs for next year, which will start online and be online until we can determine when we will be able to move to a hybrid situation and do, kind of at home and in-house. And then when we'll be able to move to that, we'll have to decide, but we will start online definitely. Including, so amongst our programs, we have the Semicolon Club offerings. We have 5 sessions of that on Saturdays with different moderators for each session. We have several great lectures and workshops, including in February, we have a lecture by Hadley Droge, who's a curator at the Afro-American Museum up in Wilberforce, talking about their exhibit, Queens of the Heartland. And we have our Wednesday evening series led by Dr. Getz here. And next year's theme is After Uncle Tom's Gabbin', Black Voices for Justice. Okay, now it's time for your plug.
Good. And just to say a little bit about that, obviously Harriet Beecher Stowe drew heavily on Black voices when she was writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. In our first session in February, we'll look at some of those sources that she used. But the main push for the year is Black writing for justice, Black voices for justice after Uncle Tom's Cabin. And we realized quickly reading any of their work that they knew the battle wasn't over. Just because slavery had been outlawed in the amendment and the war had been won by the North, that didn't mean the fight for equality was in any sense finished. So we'll look at some writers from the 19th and 20th century who reflect that. And one of those, I thought I'd give you a little sample with, again, the Christmas theme. One of those is Langston Hughes, whom we'll discuss in one of the sessions in the spring. And here's a poem called Merry Christmas by Langston Hughes. It was written in December of 1930, published in December of 1930. So during the early days of the Depression. Hughes writes, Merry Christmas, China, from the gunboats in the river, 10-inch shells for Christmas gifts, and peace on earth forever. Merry Christmas, India, to Gandhi in his cell. From righteous Christian England, ring out, bright Christmas bell. Ring Merry Christmas, Africa, from Cairo to the Cape. Ring hallelujahs, praise the Lord, for murder and rape. Ring Merry Christmas, Haiti, and drown the voodoo drums. We'll rob you to the Christian hymns until the next Christ comes. Ring Merry Christmas, Cuba, while Yankee domination keeps a nice fat president in a little half-starved nation. And to you down and outers, due to economic laws, oh, eat, drink, and be merry with a breadline Santa Claus. While all the world hails Christmas, while all the church bells sway, while, better still, the Christian guns proclaim this joyous day, while holy steel that makes us strong spits forth a mighty Yuletide song, shoot Merry Christmas everywhere, let Merry Christmas gas the air. So another tough a poet trying to come to terms with the injustice in the world.
All right, well.
I hate to leave everybody on a down note like that.
You know how to let out with a bang, don't you? All right, so again, thank you all for coming this evening. I do appreciate it. I want to thank Dr. Christine Anderson and Dr. John Getz for their thoughtful questions and selection of things for us to think about. So everyone have as well as you can, a joyous season with you and your families. And we will see you again next year, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been
Thank
fun.
you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
Fallon, Christine, great